Thank you, Caroline. John, it's beautiful. Thank you for blessing this sanctuary with sacred music, reminding us of who we are and to whom we belong. I remember when my brothers and I were just kids, my father used to like to tease us, saying that he always wanted a daughter. All he got were boys. He'd say, all I wanted was a little girl to hold, to cherish, to love. What did God do? He blessed me with you 3 smelly boys. My brothers and I would giggle sort of the way you did. I remember hearing the story of the day I was born. My father was not there. This was back in the day where men were still at work or perhaps out in the waiting room getting ready to hand out cigars, certainly not in the delivery room or the birthing room as we call it now. No, Dad was at work and he phoned the hospital to see how things were going. You're a father again, Reverend Giuliano, they said. He said, boy or girl? They said, another boy. He said, send him back. I remember one night my father teasing my brothers and I about wanting daughters, or at least one daughter instead of sons, by telling us that he even had names for girls picked out for each one of us had we been born a girl. For my oldest brother, Stephen, he said, you would have been called Diana. For my next older brother, David, he said, you would have been called Susanna. Mark, if you were a girl, I was going to name you Roxanne. Of course, my brothers and I would roll on the floor with laughter, teasing one another, calling each other by our girl names. Hey, Diana. Hey, Roxanne. Of course, we knew my father was kidding, right? Because no parent in the right mind would torture a child by calling them Roxanne with a last name Giuliano. Just wouldn't fit. Roxy Giuliano. Still wouldn't work. No, Dad teased us a lot wanting daughters. But it seemed to me the naming that my father did as a kid pleased us. Not only the names we've been given, but even the play names he gave us. It allowed us to somehow connect to the Father, to my father, to his sense of humor, to his playfulness with his 3 smelly boys. This past week, when I opened the scripture readings for the feast day of St. John, John the Baptist Day, and I read about the naming of John, it dawned on me that throughout history and throughout many, many cultures, including our own, that the naming of the children has always been the father's business. Now, I know today, young parents, we name our children together, right? My wife and I picked our kids' names together. But when you think about it, all of us bear a last name that is connected to the father. If you're a single woman, your last name is connected to your father. If you get married, and you take your husband's last name, now your last name's connected to your husband's father, but always to the father. My last name is Giuliano. It's connected to my dad, who is a Giuliano, to his father, who was a Giuliano, and his father before that, and on it went. I don't know how far back. It's always been connected to the father. In fact, not only is my last name connected to the father, but my first name is connected to my father. My name is R. Mark Giuliano. People always ask, what's the R stand for? I like to say, righteous. But it's not. Nothing so whimsical or fancy as righteous. It's Robert. That's my father's first name. He and I are both Roberts or Bobs. And as they'd say when I was a kid, well, we didn't want to get you mixed up, so we started calling you by your middle name, Mark. Seems to me, in many cultures, whether we like it or not, the naming of children has been the father's business. Maybe some of you remember that absolutely powerful scene in that wonderfully moving story that was made into a mini-series made for television back in the 1970s, where that young father took his newborn son out of the little village in which that child had been born and walked him out into the dark night, into the woods, and took him there to a place where there was a clearing, and he lifted his son up to the stars and the moon and dedicated his child to God by naming him. Dad lifted his son and said, Kunta Kinte. I don't know whether it sits well with us or not, but the fact of the matter is that throughout time, throughout many, many, many cultures, including our own, the naming of children has been the father's business. Now, that's what strikes me as so odd about the naming of John. What a peculiar story when you think about it, because John is not named by his father, Zechariah. John does not take his father's name, Zechariah. In fact, John is named, are you ready? He was named by his mother. Or at least she was the one who announced to the family and friends that his name would be John, not the father. Now, some of you are probably, if you know your scriptures well, or you heard me introduce the scripture today, you're probably saying to yourself, well, Zechariah couldn't name his son John because he was temporarily mute. Remember, he was in the temple serving the Lord, and the angel Gabriel appeared to him and said, Zechariah, in your old age, you and Elizabeth will conceive and bear a son, and you shall call him John, and you shall call him John. Right away, Zechariah has lost a kind of power and privilege if he's going to be faithful to God in naming his own son. And Zechariah is so dumbfounded by this, literally. He's made mute temporarily by Gabriel. He said, look, because of your doubt, because of your disbelief in what God can do in your life, you will be temporarily mute until Elizabeth bears this child. So you may say, well, you see, Zechariah couldn't name his son because he was mute, but he could write. You do remember after the townsfolk and even the elders, when they came to circumcise the child, and they said, what's the name of this child? The very same way the pastor today said to the young couples, what is the name of this child? And Elizabeth says, his name is John. And they're like, wait a minute. His daddy must have something to say about this. Zechariah, is this right? Zechariah motions for a writing tablet, says the scripture. And he writes it down. He says, his name is John. Elizabeth is right. It's very peculiar that Luke even takes the time to make sure we know that Zechariah doesn't name this child. You see, in the time of Zechariah and Elizabeth, and by the way, just in case you've forgotten, Elizabeth has a relative in the scriptures. You know who her cousin is, right? Mary. Mary is the mother of Jesus. Elizabeth and Mary are cousins. And they're both pregnant at the same time. And they can feel the children in their bellies moving at the same time before they're born. This is a celebration of God's promise. This is the naming of a child, but it's not the father's business. In that time, it's surely children, sons, would have been named after the father. You've heard names like Ben Johnson or Bin Laden. It means son of Laden or son of Johnson. Or if you're Dutch, it'd be Van somebody, son of. Van Dyke, Dick Van Dyke, son of Dyke. And if we anglicized it a little more, it'd be Dyke's son or Dixon, right? And Sam's son would have been called Samson, or Samuel's son, Samuelson. Zechariah's son would have been Ben Zechariah, or Zechariah's son. But not so in Luke's gospel, not in the account of the naming of John. It is Elizabeth who announces the child's name.